remembering the traumatic legacy of lynching in our area. Today, a group dug up soil outside the old Baltimore County Jail in Towson. They put it in a jar to remember Howard Cooper.
Cooper was one of more than 4,000 victims of racial terror lynchings in America. No fewer than 40 of these murders occurred in Maryland. Cooper was lynched in 1885, but the seed of his demise may have been planted in 1870 with the passage of the 15th Amendment, giving black men the right to vote. There was a major celebration in Baltimore, including a parade and a speech by Frederick Douglass.
It represented endless possibilities for the future. The end of slavery as we know it, certainly it was a way of defining freedom for African Americans. It was a way to participate in the political process.
The vote represented hope, but that hope faded when faced with the reality of Maryland politics. Democrats controlled state government for decades after the Civil War, and they were hostile to civil rights. Enter the Reverend Harvey Johnson of Union Baptist Church. By 1885, the dynamic young leader recognized that elections may not be the best tool to advance civil rights.
He not only read the Bible, he read law. He read the Maryland Constitution. He read the United States Constitution. He could literally verbatim give you the Bill of Rights. He believed that the full exercise of law was the freedom lever for his people.
He has grown frustrated with the state of politics in Maryland. He recognizes that the Democratic Party does not offer any hope. He recognizes that the Republican Party is not going to be an avenue towards change. So he begins to look in other directions.
Johnson looked to the courts and in 1885 created one of the nation's first civil rights organizations.
So the Brotherhood of Liberty is an organization that was constituted to challenge racial inequality in Maryland through the legal system.
2 early wins vindicated that strategy. In February, 4 black women won damages from a steamer company after being denied first-class passage they had paid for. In March, the state bar was forced to admit black attorneys for the first time. Then, in April, in the Baltimore County village of Rockland, a fateful encounter set off a tragic chain of events.
At 6 o'clock, April 4th, 1885, Katie Gray had just gone to the railroad station with her sister. Katie Gray was coming back from the railroad station when she met Howard Cooper. And she had apparently known Howard Cooper before. They had words. Katie turned, started walking home. Howard Cooper followed Katie Gray into the woods where something happened.
It's impossible to know the truth of what happened that day. Cooper had a history of harassment. Both later testified that Cooper did accost the girl.
After about 2 hours, Katie Gray's dog, Bruno, comes running out barking and presumably chases Howard Cooper away. Katie Gray runs back to her household, and her father is incensed. Her father very quickly figures out what happened. She probably mentions Howard Cooper's name, and within hours, Daniel Gray, Katie Gray's father, puts together friends, I think it's fair to call them a mob, who scour the countryside looking for Howard Cooper.
Cooper eludes the mob for 5 days. The manhunt consumes the county. There is no presumption of innocence. Negro guilty of fiendish assault. The excitement is intense over an outrage committed by a Negro named Howard Cooper. When Cooper is captured, he will be hung up to the nearest tree. This house is built on the foundation of a barn where Cooper hid. A friend told Howard to wait while he went for food. The man soon returned, but not with food.
Before long, 4 people jump Howard Cooper in a barn and bring him to the Towson jail.
Word of his capture spread quickly, and soon the jail is surrounded by a mob eager to get their hands on him. With the prisoner's life in danger, the sheriff immediately moves him to the Baltimore City Jail. Even there, Cooper attracts a crowd.
Wherever they thought Howard Cooper might be, a mob appeared, mostly of friends in the community of Rockland.
In Rockland and the county, the demand for retribution intensified in the weeks leading up to the trial. Cooper faced charges of assault and rape. The court of public opinion had already reached a verdict.
When you look at the coverage of the newspapers, they present it as if there's no doubt that he had raped her. And why the rape charge is important is because the rape charge is what triggered the potential death penalty.
On the day of his trial, Cooper was taken to court early as threats were made on his life. Extra police were called in to handle the crush of people trying to get into the courtroom. Muttered threats are heard on all sides, and it is the belief of many that the Negro will yet suffer death at the hands of Katie Gray's friends. The courtroom is crowded to suffocation.
Like a lot of the cases in this period, it's hard to say what evidence there was that he actually committed the crime. He admits that he attacked Gray, but throughout the trial, he is steadfast in denying that he ever raped her. She doesn't claim rape. In the beginning of the trial, the only person that testifies that Cooper had raped her was Gray's doctor, who examined her the next day.
The trial lasted barely 4 hours. The jury of 12 white men didn't bother to leave their seats. It took them less than a minute to find Cooper guilty of both counts. The Sun breathlessly named it the most shocking crime ever perpetrated in Maryland. He returned to court the next day and was sentenced to death. Cooper was held in Baltimore while his lawyers filed an appeal to the state's highest court, claiming his 14th Amendment rights had been violated because blacks were excluded from the jury pool. They knew the state appeal had little chance of succeeding, but it bought them time to raise funds to file an appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court.
What Harvey Johnson is hoping to do is to bring this case out of the state courts. He doesn't have much hope that the state courts are going to rule in favor of him, but he does hope that if he can get a case to the Supreme Court, then the Supreme Court will rule on the federal level that what's happening in the state is unconstitutional.
So while the Maryland court considered Cooper's state appeal, Johnson got to work raising money for a federal appeal.
I think the possibility of this appeal to the Supreme Court absolutely magnified the intensity of those persons who felt like, oh my God, he may get away with this crime.
So when the white community in Towson learned that the African American community was getting close to achieving its goal of raising enough money, they were up in arms.
I think it quite frankly scared them. They saw in short order that Johnson was successful in these two cases in the previous months before the Cooper case. And now they see the same person going after the Cooper case as well. And I think they're fearful that he's going to succeed in this case as well. And I think that certainly, upped the stakes, ratcheted up the tension in this period.
On June 23rd, as expected, Cooper's state appeal was denied. The governor signed a death warrant setting the execution for July 31st. Cooper was returned to Towson at the end of June, even as Reverend Johnson was nearing his goal. His efforts were aided by the size of his congregation.
Can you imagine having 8% of the Negro population, the colored population, members of your church? So he's talking to them every week. And that was amazing power. And they were intellectual leaders, business leaders.
And the moment that Harvey Johnson and his parishioners pushed that fundraising effort over the limit or over the line, there is a very strong reaction by not only the Baltimore Sun, but also some of the papers throughout the state.
On Saturday, July 11th, Cooper was 20 days away from his execution. That morning, the Towson paper reported that his lawyers had already prepared the Supreme Court appeal and were only waiting for the money to file it. We think the patience of the people of Baltimore County is being severely tried in this matter. There may be a great deal of law in all this nonsense, but we fail to see where justice comes in. That same day, they got the money they needed through the instrumentality of Reverend Harvey Johnson. The appeal would be filed on Monday.
They were incensed and they thought, this brute is going to get away with it, so we have to take matters in our own hands.
By this time, they'd been just chomping at the bit to get their chance to lynch Howard Cooper, and they did not want to wait any longer.
The next day was Sunday, July 12th.
Rumors start to filter through the town that something is going to happen soon.
In twos and threes, men collect on the outskirts of town.
One man pulls a rope out from underneath his jacket, says, "This is a cravat for Howard Cooper."
As darkness gathers, groups of masked men converge on the jail.
The mob waits until Monday morning, actually 12 midnight, Sunday to Monday, because they didn't want to do a lynching on a Sunday.
Just after midnight, a group tries to batter the front door using a flagpole. From the family quarters on the second floor, the sheriff's daughter directs them to the back. There, the mob has an easier time of it. They break the door down, find Cooper hiding under a mattress in his cell, and drag him outside with a noose already around his neck. They waste no time tossing the rope over the branch of a nearby sycamore tree. One witness says the whole affair was orderly and expeditious.
And about 40 men pull on one end, lifting Howard Cooper off the ground. He dies of asphyxiation. Usually, hanging somebody is quick, it breaks somebody's neck, but in this case, it's a long process of suffocation.
The local paper's account begins, "The Cooper case has been summarily disposed of without the intervention of the Supreme Court." By 3 in the morning, the mob had disbanded, leaving Cooper's body hanging in front of the jail in full view.
We know that a train slowed down so that their passengers could look out and see the body. This would have been about 7 o'clock in the morning. His mother came and collected his body around noon of that day, put it in a buckboard and brought it to the church on Bologna Road in Rockland, where he lies today in an unmarked grave.
That might have been the end of the story, but renewed interest in these lynchings has prompted renewed scrutiny and new revelations.
So I went to the soil collection.
After the ceremony, historian Jenny Lyles was determined to learn more about the victim and his family.
So here's the 1870 census. It is the 9th district, which is Towson Town. I found him in the 1870 census with his mother, his grandparents, and his twin brother.
At the time of his lynching, Cooper was said to be anywhere from 19 to 24 years old. The census tells a far different story.
So here you can find Henrietta Cooper. It says Celeste, Howard, Henry. And Howard and Henry, it's 6 out of 12, so 6 months. He was 6 months old. Then by 1885, that means he could have only been 15 years old, no more. And that was rather shocking to me, that I was no longer looking for a man of 25, that I was looking at a kid.
Today, Towson is the Baltimore County seat, a legal center, and a college town. But in 1885, a child was lynched here. What we do with that knowledge, that truth, will determine the kind of community our own children inherit.
In order for us, if we're going to have any meaningful reconciliation, any meaningful progress in race relations, we have to understand and know that history. It's too important not to know.
Thank you. That was very well done. The most shocking crime ever committed in Maryland. Is that what this was?
Well, that's what they wrote.
Yeah.
I think the shocking crime was that they lynched a child. That was the shocking crime.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, do you want me to just
go ahead.
give a little background on how I came to this?
Yes.
Okay.
give us some background, Will, on how you kind of came to
Yeah.
all of this.
So I'm going to try and give you the Reader's Digest version here. I started when Brian Stevenson was on his book tour for Just Mercy about, I guess that was 4 years ago or so. A friend of mine who's a federal public defender up here in Baltimore told me about this guy. He said, you know, he hears he's a rock star, blah, blah, blah. I hadn't heard of him. I hadn't read the book, but I did. We went to see him. My family went to see him. And in the course of giving this, his book talk, he mentioned that EJI had just completed its first report on lynching in America, and that they had been able to document, at that point it was, I think, over 4,200 lynchings. I know it's up to 44, at least right now. And I have to say that just kind of was a shock to me. I had no idea. The report that they did, the EJI report, was kind of focused on the 11 Confederate states and Kentucky. Those 12 states were where most of these lynchings had occurred. And so I thought, well, someone must be doing this kind of work in Maryland. And I set out to see if I could find someone that was doing this work so that I could, you know, I make films, and I thought it would be an interesting story. Largely due, I'm sure, to my own failures as a researcher, I really couldn't find anyone that was doing it. So I ended up working with another friend of mine who is teaches high school history at high school and close by. And we did a kind of a semester with as an extracurricular activity for his students. I go in once a week. We would have Skype interviews with you know, people from EJI, with different experts all over the place, and it was pretty cool. And I know that by the time I got to that end of that, I couldn't leave it, and that's kind of when I started this organization. And it was also during that time that I learned about the Howard Cooper lynching. Originally, EJI had documented, I think, 28. Well, other people in Maryland, Nick Creary, who we saw at the end of the show there, he had and his graduate students have documented, I think, 40 or 41. I think we're up to 42 now. And the Howard Cooper lynching, it happened a mile away from here. I mean, it's a mile and a quarter away from where I live. So it was, it was just stunning to me. And then even at that, we did the soil collection and all of that, and we really didn't know what the full story was because we were going by newspaper accounts and assuming that he was as old as they said he was. And Jenny Lyles, who I think may be on this call somewhere, she was at the soil collection, and she did some research on his family and found that census stuff, and she's found incredible stuff beyond that. But I mean, that was really stunning. I mean, we wouldn't have known that if we hadn't had that ceremony, and she wasn't there because she took it on herself to do that. So that's how I came to this particular story, the Howard Cooper lynching. And then this film, as the other film, the George Armwood film that we did, which is the last lynching in Maryland in 1931, those were both done to be shown at this conference that we have sponsored the last couple of years on lynching in Maryland, and we'll do it again this year, we hope.
Thank you, Will. So just to put things in perspective, so this film represents one case in a total of 44 that are currently documented in terms of racial terror lynchings in Maryland. And this is something that really drew me to the work of Will, but also drew me to the subject of racial terror lynching, specifically in Maryland, because as Will mentioned, most of the 4,000 plus lynchings that are documented by EJI are focused in the Deep South, right? But what a lot of people don't realize and fail to realize that lynching took place in Maryland, in states outside the Deep South, and had the same effects that they did in the Deep South that they did in these other border states, if you will. And so, Will, in terms of, I guess, your work, what are your thoughts surrounding why Maryland is obviously left out in the larger scale of things?
Well, I think they were going, for the low-hanging fruit. I mean, they were going where most of these occurred, but there were, I think lynchings occurred in, I want to say 39 or 40 states in the Union. And I think most people would assume that the lynchings that occurred in Maryland, most of them would be on the Eastern Shore. That's not the case. Most of them were, actually the two counties with the most lynchings are Anne Arundel County and Prince George's County. Each had 5. So I think that's...
Thank you. Andy, did you have anything? What are your thoughts?
Andy's muted, it looks
Oh,
like.
he's muted. Well, while we're waiting,
There we go. I'm on. I wanted to ask. I wanted to ask Will, what is there now that commemorates this horrific event?
So right now, we did the soil collection that day, and that soil is in the museum in Montgomery.
PKI.
And we had applied for, and we proposed to have an historic marker put in at the jail, and it was approved earlier this year. But then when we were supposed to actually install it May 23rd, but we've had to change our plan. So we'll probably do it sometimes in the fall, in November. We hope, if conditions are right. But we're working with coalitions. There were 18 counties in Maryland where we know these lynchings occurred. There are 24 counties in Maryland. And so we are working with groups now in 14 of the 18 counties where these lynchings occurred. And so we're working not on these different kinds of community remembrance projects, the soil collection, as well as the historic marker, as well as just making sure that people understand that this happened, and that it continues to have a grip on us.
We've been watching statues being torn down. We've been watching lots of changes happening in our midst right now as we're speaking. And I wanted to ask, maybe bringing Corey into the conversation, ask you about what is the significance of these commemorations. I know they have a very deep feeling for people, of course, for or against certain things. But what is the significance of putting a statue or commemoration to an event?
So, thank you. I think that the biggest issue that I'm finding is that when we talk about tearing down monuments, and then we talk about erecting monuments, we forget that these monuments and their history are tied to some reverberating influence on our health. We talk about lynchings as if they are just a one-time event. But what happens to the people that either witnessed or heard the narrative passed down for years? It's kind of the story we tell in elementary school. If I tell you a secret or tell you a whisper in your ear, by the time it gets to the 30th student, it's not the same. So just imagine the pain of the grandmother, the brother that told the story, that continued to tell the story to keep the name alive. So when we erect monuments, it can sometimes provide a place of healing, but we also must recognize that we have to counter that with allowing people to be open to express their pain. A lot of this, we try to quell the pain of people, and then it bottles in and it comes out in other ways. The film itself, it hurts just to watch it. And I'm not in 1870, of course. I'm not in 1885, but it's the humanity that connects us to see another human being, first of all, not given an opportunity to defend himself, and second of all, being picked apart just because of how he looks on the outside. It's heart-wrenching. So the monument erection will bring another level of pain just because it does remind us of our past. But we have to allow for any sores or heartache to be open to the air for healing to actually take place. You can't bandage it. I mean, a doctor always says, take the bandage off after a day or two, let air hit it, and it will naturally heal. Because you still have to go through that process of the natural healing.
Will, you mentioned that there is no reconciliation without truth. This is obviously a piece of truth that's being unearthed. How, and this is to all of you, Charles also, how close are we to that place of reconciliation? Do we ever get there? Is there's so much truth that still is waiting to be unearthed, literally and figuratively? And how close are we as a country, as a society, to get to that level of reconciliation?
Yeah, I think if I can take a jab at it, I think I have take issues sometimes with the usage of the term reconciliation, specifically in the American context, specifically when you look at the way the system was structured and built. It was built on the oppression and subjugation of people of African descent, as well as Native Americans and so on, right? And so taking that into consideration, like, what are we going back towards, right? So this whole reconciling piece. I think, just to as it relates to Dr. Henderson's work, which I think is so remarkable, the way in which he tracks this from a health standpoint. So lynchings then, but not just become statistics, but they become evidence of continued trauma, a trauma that Christina Sharp names as the wake. It's never ending and unrelenting. And, here we are talking about this lynching that took place in 1885, when we have 2 suspected lynchings in California, right? And so, okay, we understand that these things are part of history, and we don't even need to stretch our imagination to see the connections to lynching and police brutality. But what happens when you continue to see these lynchings, the ones that which we have, as of recent, have begun seeing rise? But also in 2014, there was a specific case in North Carolina in which an individual was found hanging, who allegedly committed suicide, right? And so, yeah, those are my thoughts about it. I think you have to deal with the system overall, and I think this moment has really forced truth to the light. But as it relates to the Black and Brown communities, this is the truth that they've lived with throughout their lives. And as Corey mentioned, it has a tremendous impact on their health. And Corey, if you wouldn't mind just discussing a little bit about your trauma, your model as it relates to trauma, and the ways in which you highlight how this affects the Black community from a health standpoint.
Yeah, so historical trauma, by definition, are the 5 areas that any subjugated population all experience collectively. It's segregation, it's serial forced displacement. It's not you being displaced because Johns Hopkins or some school needs that land, like New York, the school in New York needed part of the land in Harlem. There are many instances of eminent domain, but we're literally picking you up and moving you. When the Great Fire of 1904, 1905 happened in Baltimore City, where you see Union Baptist Church is where African Americans used to live downtown at the bottom, where we would call the harbor area. But as you come up Charles Street, go down St. Paul Street to go watch the fireworks, you see it goes downhill. So everything, the water, which you would wash down, would go towards these communities. And they had a plan to redo downtown Baltimore. They moved these people, seriously forced to displace them, and dropped them where we would call the Druid Hill area, right near Martin Luther King, and Union Baptist Church began around that community. You then have psychological and physical abuse. The psychological abuse, lynchings, we talk about walkable neighborhoods, walkability, and air quality. First of all, most people would be excited just to get a loan. So you're not going to go and say, I'm not going to buy a house in this neighborhood because the air quality is not well. You're going to say, oh, I got to go ahead and spend this money before they rescind it. That's the psychological part, that you don't feel entitled to what you earned. So you are always rushing to do something without proper planning. Everybody else I know, including those who are academics, we take the time to think about what we're about to do. But when you're psychologically impacted, you got to hurry up and do it because you don't know if it's going to be rescinded. You're always thinking, oh, I just need one thing to pop up on my credit and remove that loan. That's a psychological and the mental abuse. The physical abuse, the killings we see in the streets, but also the pain we feel, which affects our ability to communicate with one another. That's a physical effect of how we treat our mates, how we treat our husbands, wives, children. We bring that pain to bear at home. African-American men and Africans, those who are poor, who can't eat, work, they drink. That goes home with their families. They wind up trying to be ultra man in other ways. So that's the physical. Then we have the economic deprivation. Just in the Black community in Baltimore alone, you couldn't have a CPA in Baltimore till the late 1950s, early 1960s. So how could Black institutions build wealth if you couldn't corporately build and restructure your finances to take account for the accounting of the money? So now we have economic loss. In West Baltimore, specifically in that community, because it is segregated and it's been seriously forced displaced. I mean, we're talking lung disease, Black lung disease. The police wouldn't even go in the community. Tuberculosis, they said it was a Black disease until whites started getting it. That all led to no one wanting to live near Blacks in West Baltimore. How does that relate to economic deprivation? When the jobs left, that whole community of people suffered. So now we're economically deprived, which leads us to cultural dispossession. How do I be able and be in a position to laugh, dance, joke, have a good time the way I want to, if everything that I do, someone tells me that it's not the way the Queen does it. It's not the way you're supposed to speak English. It's not the way we eat. It's not, we're constantly judging ourselves against what we see on television, against what people tell us beautiful is, and how we see within our own community, within my own family. There's a black, light-skinned, mulatto judgment of who's darker. And we joke about it, but it's so real because it becomes part of our innate way of how we communicate. So that's what I've discovered, is that there's a lost connection in family. There's a lost connection in how we define ourselves. There's a lost connection in how we define our health. Just the pain and stress of what I just described to you causes a level of inflammation that affects your ability to fight disease, which causes the ability for you to have diabetes and other things that lead to a COVID-19 disparity in health. So just those things alone, those 5 key buckets, if we experience those collectively, it's historical trauma.
Thank you so much, Corey. Let's see if we have any questions from, I guess, Twitter or the audience, social media. Audrey, are there any questions people we have queued up?
Yeah, we have a few from the chat. So I'm going to go ahead and kind of paraphrase a few of them because we have a few that are along the same lines. And I think these are very specifically potentially able to be answered by Will, though Dr. Henderson, please jump in as well. A few of our listeners, including Michelle Scott, and a few others want to know, for example, regarding the research into their history of racial terror lynching. Have there been additional types of family history research done into other racial terror lynchings? In the case of Howard Cooper specifically, do we know what happened to his other family members?
Sorry.
Yeah, and I think this one just makes sense to pair with this as well. Have you found any of his family's descendants to be part of the ceremony when the marker goes up?
So yes, and this is largely, this is entirely due to the work of Jenny Lyles. Jenny, thank you so much. I know you're out there. So following that soil collection, she kept on it, not only after the census information she found, she was able to trace his family both backwards and forwards. And she, last year, was able to locate and speak with Howard Cooper's first cousin thrice removed, who is a woman in her 70s now living in Delaware. And she is very interested in being part of this. So we're looking forward to having her and any other members of her family join us as well.
If I could just jump in and add something, I think that what you're describing, we all need to be in a position where we know where we come from and where we're going. And it's a lot of work. It's taken me 2.5 years just to go back to about 1807, 1810. A friend of mine, we do this and we get together and try to look at the census records and try to piece together our families to know more about it. It's so interesting to learn my grandfather having 20-some children living on a farm in the early 1900s, seeing him get married, living in his father-in-law's house, and then 15, 20 years later, owning a farm that's worth $500. But the pain and pressure of living like that in North Carolina, what toll did that take on my grandfather that then brought that to bear on my father? Then brought that to bear on the children in the family. What's the brokenness in our family? How do we heal if we can't even deal with there's alcoholism or there's a deep level of pain? Why is granddad so angry? Why does he say, I don't like white people? Why don't we talk about these things? Why is the church afraid to deal with the pain of the people that we're preaching hope to? But we're leaving them with just hope in the church. But when they go home, there's no hope outside of the church. Why are we afraid to deal with the pain that people have? And we can't heal from it until we acknowledge it. We must acknowledge it. And that's where I'm trying to push the narrative that we just need to start talking about what happened and what was. In design thinking, we say we need to know what was so that we can now know what is, so we can plan for what we want it to be. And as Dr. Chavis said, we can't plan on what we want it to be reconciliation, redemption, or anything like that if we don't even know where we're coming from? Because we keep thinking we're reconciling, but we're just repeating.
That's, if I can just add to that, that's a large part of what our work involves. I mean, it occurred to me a while ago that there are two features of American exceptionalism that are at play here. One is denial, and the other is arrogance. For too long, we've refused to recognize this history of ours, and I think a large part of moving forward is, as you say, confronting the past and acknowledging it. Cheryl and Eiffel talks about projects of reconciliation, and which she defines as confronting these difficult truths and then taking personal responsibility for injustice. And I think that's kind of what we're trying to work towards here.
So, Dr. Swartz, are you familiar with the work done by the Peace and Reconciliation Commission down in South Africa with with Desmond Tutu and others?
Yes, a little bit. I mean, not
that pain of coming to bear, to sit at the table and to acknowledge that I tried to take your family's farm, I raped your daughter, I did this, I did that. We are so far away from anything like that. But how does that resolve the problem? To what Dr. Chavis said, and I'm gonna pass it back. When you begin to study and read on that, it's like what's happening in South Africa. You still have people living in shanty towns. So just because we come to the table and talk about our pain, that's not going to resolve the fact that I'm still hungry. And that's where we need to figure out what the answer to the problem is, by understanding what we did before, so we can plan for something better, building and stacking on what the past was for the future. Dr. Chavis?
Yeah, and I think just transitioning, I mean, you're spot on, right? The truth telling is one piece, but at this point, I think we're at a point where we must have, you mentioned preparing, Corey, I think we have to actually have social transformation. It's time for work to be done to reform and to support Black communities who have suffered this trauma. I focus on specifically the racial terror lynching in the Eastern Shore of Maryland, the case of Matthew Williams, as well as George Armour, but Matthew Williams specifically. And what I noticed specifically is the economic ties, the community ties, but also I've worked briefly with a community that's there now in Salisbury, and you can still see the socioeconomic gap, the damage that's done economically that's really started following this lynching. Very similar to what we see in Tulsa. And I know that this is a model that you're familiar with as it relates to the economic downturn of these communities post-racial terror. And so for me, I think we're at a moment to where, yes, the truth telling must continue, but we have to understand that in Black communities, this is something that, and especially in America, we always have known about, right? But now what we're witnessing is the larger white community wake up and acknowledge what we've always known and always have discussed. And I don't want to, there's still secrecy in the Black community, as Corey can attest, but there's a certain things that you were scared to ask about, as it relates to your family history, but you knew, like, don't go around this area or don't go here. You knew that certain individuals were racist and not to be around them. I know, speaking from my experience and my father's experience growing up in North Carolina, those are things that he kind of relayed to me, right? But these are different conversations that have to happen as it relates to the broader white community as well as America as a whole. So that's my 2 cents. But Will,
I want a general statement that people are saying, Will. I listen. I try to keep my ear to the streets, as they say. I try to be as regular as possible. As much as I like to read, you still need to hear what young people talk about, so we can try to bridge the gap. And you hear this statement all the time, like there's been this shift in thinking. I would never have been a slave. I would never have allowed these things to happen to me. Right. And we need to face those types of conversations, because there is a bravado that goes along, and a hubris that goes along with being young. And then we get to a place where it's like these systems that we want to fight. I'm reading a book now about the root narrative and conflict resolution. One of your professors down at the school, I saw it and was reading the book. And it's true. It's the stories that were told in the early 1800s, when they told a story by a planter that Blacks could live through dysentery and Blacks could survive better in Southern climates. They did not give medicine to blacks during the Civil War and in Reconstruction, because they said, oh no, we read that you guys could handle this. You guys don't need medicine. And those types of narratives and stories that are being passed on, they're lies. And we need to just call them out and face it. Sorry, Will.
Can I just add something here? Because we brought up Charles, you brought up the Matthew Williams thing. And this is, I think, a hopeful note. In Salisbury, Matthew Williams and someone, who was the other lynching that happened in Salisbury there? Not the unnamed guy, but it was one in the 19th century. Anyway, there were 2 black men lynched right on the courthouse lawn there in Salisbury. There is a plaque on the courthouse lawn to a General John Winder, who was a Confederate general, and he had some very tenuous association with Wicomico County, but they kind of claimed him as their own. And he wasn't just and so here you have a plaque to a Confederate general right at the spot where 2 black men were lynched. And he wasn't just a garden variety general, he was a son of a bitch. He ran the prisons for the Confederacy east of the Mississippi. Henderson. He was the one that was responsible for the Andersonville massacre there. Essentially, anywhere between 15 and 20,000 men were killed, were starved to death, and so on. And this plaque has been a flashpoint in Salisbury for years. And yet, Friday morning, it was taken down. Yeah. Rather unceremoniously. So I'd like to think of that as an indication that change can happen. It's insidious.
People are tired. And I like to ask a question to Andy. And I think the question goes to what Will is talking about. What happens when we get to a place where there are these inflection points that people are tired? But at the same time as being tired, we're not just trying to convince ourselves to heal. We also need to bring to bear the white community, the Jewish community, the Italian community. People try to blanketly say white as if white is just everything. These are Italians, Germans. These are immigrants coming together that look like they're white, and they just get to blend in. We didn't have that privilege, because when I walk in a room, you can tell that I'm not Italian, German, or anything else. I'm different. But how do we get them to come to the table? Because if you're because of systemic racism, if you're benefiting from the opportunity of, hey, I get the privilege and the benefits of whatever happens, whether I meant to or not, just by my parents' wealth, I get to enjoy other things, then how do you get me to come to the table to kind of back away from that privilege, to have an honest conversation about the pain that people feel?
I had one follow-up. I was just thinking about this moment, you're right. You talked about the inflection points. And I think what for me, and this is something that I continue to riff on over and over again, I want to see the mass support and discuss for these things continuing.
For me, Corey, I think my family moved to this country in 1966. I was a young child then, and saw race firsthand when the assassination of King happened in 1968, and saw the riots on the streets. And I made it my business to understand race in America and all this. And I've always wondered, why aren't black people angrier? Why isn't there a revolution taking place already in this country? And this is honestly, in the past 20 days or whatever, this new uprising that's happened, I've seen more hope and more possibilities for change than I ever have in the 50 some odd years I've been living in this country. So I see a lot of possibilities. I do also hear now more people talking about the idea of reparations that was brought up just a few moments ago, because I don't believe you can just have, a kumbaya moment, people walk away and get back to like square one. I think people need to be made whole in order for them to feel like they're part of the system and be able to move forward. I've always wondered about that. And I think the role of white people, young white people particularly, in this movement that we're seeing today is so critical and so important. And I see them really putting themselves on the line and willing to at a small level at least, understand the idea of privilege, talk about privilege, and be able to address it in a more direct way and call each other out, which is really remarkable. That's something that hasn't happened in the past. You know, books like White Fragility are selling, you know, like crazy. Books like, you know, like Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be Anti-Racist, are #1 bestsellers. This is new. This is something new in America. So I see a lot of possibilities in the role of whites, particularly, whether Italian, Irish, whatever, they've all benefit from the white privilege, really taking a whole different turn here.
So I think,
and honestly, to add one more thing, this could not have happened had we elected Hillary Clinton. We have Trump to thank for this, for whatever he's done. He is the one that has catalyzed this moment to a level that could have never happened under a different administration, I think.
Well, I mean, definitely we recognize that without Saul, you couldn't have a David. So I think that as we move forward, you got to have the juxtaposition of both sides. But to that point, how we got here is important. But I think that why Black people are not angrier, we don't have the opportunity to be angry, because anger elicits I bench press 405 pounds. When I get angry and my face start popping out, it's a different level of fear that people have. I'm working out and a man asked me, "Oh, what do you do for a living?" I said, "Well, you know, I study trauma and just finished my doctorate. I do communications." "You for real? You really do that?" And it's those types of questions that make me stop and say, "Are you kidding me?" So your assumption is that because I like to work out, I do construction, or because I have tattoos, I can't be intelligent, I can't read. Those types of things. When I bring fear to people, when I walk in a room and I'm a African American of size with a beard, anger. If I add anger to that, there's a whole nother level. So I think the fear for many of getting too angry is also the materialism, the Marxism. Hey, I'm gonna lose my house. I don't want to lose my house. I'm gonna lose my car. They're gonna take my job. My kid's gonna suffer. And not everybody is built to handle the strain and stress of fighting on the front lines of the struggle. And I'm not diminishing what you ask. I'm just making the statement that from talking to people, there is a real fear of showing your anger too much. And there's this like, we don't have the privilege of showing how we really feel, of crying at work. When I go to work and we don't talk about what's going on, it's just like, oh, okay, so, hey, you know, we have a meeting in an hour. And it's like, there were just 2 Black men killed. You guys aren't gonna acknowledge I'm a Black man too. It's that type of, okay, let's move on from this. We don't really wanna talk about it because we don't feel comfortable and safe dealing with that. And those are the types of things that people, we are at that point of change where we can begin to now open this up. But I do agree with you. We are at a point where we got to bring everybody to the table, because 11 to 13% of the population are not going to solve this problem by ourselves. We can love each other, but the pain of what we keep seeing weekly is only adding to our internal stress.
But as you mentioned, the idea of recognizing trauma is significant for people to be able to move on. And I think they're beginning to recognize that trauma. Somebody said about the monuments, the Confederate monuments, why are we tearing them down? They're part of our history. They're actually, you know, part of our history lessons. Why don't you leave them there for people to learn? And I'm to say that actually by tearing them down, we've learned a lot more than what we have in the past 100 some odd years. These monuments have been sitting there. So actually they have been great for learning, but in not the way that I think others want to see it.
Great, let's go ahead and see if we have a few more questions, Audrey.
Yeah.
From the audience.
So I want to circle back just a little bit because we have here with us Jenny Lyles, who Will was mentioning earlier, because she wanted to be able to say a little bit about, to that question earlier about what happened with the family members. And while we hear from her, I want to kind of throw out a few more questions from the audience, because I think that they're very relevant to the ongoing discussion that we've been having right now. So first, you know, we've got a question about, we've had questions kind of about white privilege and individuals can, reconcile. How do we get people to reconcile with white privilege? And to this end, too, one of our attendees, whose name here written here is Gonzalez, has asked a question about basically how can regular citizens, right, quote unquote, regular citizens, everyday citizens, what does it take for them to get to the point where they are part of these mobs, where they're doing that kind of violence, and not just in the past, but now, are those, are there similarities or parallels with, police brutality? What does it take for, I think we hear that a lot, right? What does it take for quote unquote good people, right, everyday citizens, to be part of this kind of white supremacy and brutality? Maybe Dr. Henderson, you can talk a little bit about this, and Will, in your own research. And another question is, just a general discussion on kind of how this past of racial terror lynching kind of links to our current present of police brutality. We have Emmanuel Aquiempo, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing that, who has been asking just about, can there be an honest discussion about racism and inequalities when, the government and a portion of the population are clinging to white privilege? So that's a lot. I'll give our panelists a chance to think a little bit about that. And Jenny, I wanted to hand it over to you to kind of answer one of the earlier question about the family.
Thank you. So I guess where I would start off is that Howard had a twin brother, Henry, and that we know that he died before he was 10, because he wasn't in the 1880 census. So we know that that was Howard's only other sibling, and that his mother was Henrietta, and she had lived with her parents from the time Howard was born until they're dying. So they all lived in the Ruxton area and continued to do so. I guess the biggest thing that I found that would relate to even the topic of trauma was that in 1870, right after she gave birth to both Howard and Henry, she was attacked. Henrietta was. And the man who attacked her and raped her was sent to the penitentiary for 10 years. It was a white man from the same community. And so he happened to go to jail at the same time that Henrietta and Howard's father, Henrietta's husband, Joshua, he went to jail as well for stealing sleigh bells. And he spent 3 months in the penitentiary for that. So the same place as her attacker at the same time. And we don't know when Howard's father had died, but it was before his lynching. There's just no record of him after the penitentiary coming back. So, I think of Howard and I think of 15 years, and I think that his mother had, newborn twin sons and was attacked brutally to the point she had to be seen by 3 doctors. 15 years later, her son is lynched. Her husband's gone and her other son is gone. And her parents are gone by that point as well. So that's what we know of that whole family by 1885. I know that she lived at least past 1900. I know she was close to the Scott family in Bear Hills, and then they disappear. So there's no other direct link there other than the Cooper family, who we spoke to on the telephone. But there's nothing else.
Could I just add one other note here that you discovered? And that I think is interesting, if not relevant, and that is that the young woman who Howard was accused of attacking, Katie Gray, she lived to be 102 years old. So there's some irony there.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it as a historian. It reminds me a lot of some of the work that I'm doing, specifically to Audrey's question about, how could members of the white community participate in this? And based on, my research, there's a certain level of privilege that's associated with participating in this. And there's the one specific case in terms of my current book that'll be out with Johns Hopkins next year. I identified one white witness who was able to give a statement to the Attorney General at the time, and I was really shocked to see this because most of the white witnesses said they knew nothing and went along with the system, right? And Sherilyn Ifill calls this system a system of silence. And so what was remarkable about this one white individual statement is that his boss, there's an announcement like there usually is with lynchings. And so the call went out, the boss let everyone off for the day, all the white workers to go participate in the lynching. This one white individual said, I'm not going to participate in that. I'm just going to stay here and work, right? And as a result of that, he came back next day and he had no job. And so just that I think that gives a prime example of the ways in which, again, these privileges are tied into whether or not you participate in these racial terror lynchings. And so, for African Americans, these are acts of terror, but in terms of the white community, specifically in the nadir of lynching in the 1890s and 1880s, these were definitely message crimes to put Black on alert. But on the other end of that, you had poor whites who oftentimes were looking for legitimacy, and they joined. Part of their privilege was really tied to how much and how well they participated. And what I've recognized in my research is that the majority of those who actually participated and did the actual dirty work in lynchings were mostly poor white laborers, whereas the orders would come down from white business owners and leaders throughout various communities throughout the country, as well as law enforcement who were oftentimes complicit and who turned the other cheek and turn the other way as lynchings took place. I just wanted to respond to that one. Corey, did you have anything?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that you bring out is that the way that the people are killed is important. And we have to shy away from calling lynchings. I think sometimes the word lynching, it elicits like, they hung them. And, then we go to, well, what did they do?
Exactly.
It's a justification. But the problem is it's a killing. It's a killing. Someone was killed prior to Blacks being lynched. Whites would lynch each other. It was a way to kind of say, I have power over you. And you take that power and then you multiply it at the space of a courthouse, at the space of a police station, at the space of in front of your house, at the space of where people can ride by and see, as Mr. Swartz video said, the train slowed down. This is not only a message, but it's a reminder that I will do what I want to do, and the police can't stop me. You can't stop me, because if I can do what I want and the police can't stop me, then that which you seek protection from, I have power over it. There's another form of pain that I have to stay in my little quarters. So I think the only hope that we continually have is that we come through this quasi-integration to a place where I see my neighbors as I go out and do my walks, and they see me living as a man. Yes, I'm a Black man, but everything I do, they're watching to see, do I look like and act like what they see on TV? And that's what happens when you don't live next to people and you don't get to see them in an environment outside of whatever narrative is told about them. To what Andy said, it's how do we get to a place where the young white population is growing up more in urban and environments where Blacks have more money and opportunity to move in environments that we didn't before. Now we live beside each other, and I'm not that bad. You like to come to my house and have a cookout and eat crabs with me and listen to my music. And your kids like rap music more than my kids. And your kids wear bandanas and headbands more than my kids. Those types of things integrate us, that you begin to see that the pain and trauma doesn't just affect one person. It's killing our country. And I say our because my family and relatives helped build it. Our country is dying because we've gotten to a place where we forgot that what you do to me, you have to be dealing with me or down on the ground with me to do that to me. You can't hold me down and keep moving forward. So you're only holding yourself back as we proceed to get to a place where we can come together. We all must open the floodgates, that we all have equal opportunity, inequity, not just equality, but we need to have equity so that we can then have an opportunity, hey, bring what you have to the table and let's deal with the pain and the brokenness of those who have been broken and pained by what happened, and let's begin to start to heal.
Dr. Henderson, can I just ask, what do you make of the, white participation in all these demonstrations that's going on? I mean, I've been around for a while too, and I don't recall ever seeing such such a great representation of white people in these kinds of actions. And I'm wondering what you make of it.
I think it's encouraging because the sad part about race is when you study race, the first thing you learn is race is a social construct. It's a made-up story, just like the United States is a made-up story. We all wrap our minds around a flag that we all decide to run behind and fight and die for. We put up invisible borders that say, this is my country. We're bordered to Canada and Mexico. But who's to say the line doesn't shift one way or the other and you step across it and now you need a passport to be here? These are all ideas that the only people that can make this up, or the Homo sapien has the ability to make up stories and we run behind it and believe it. So the idea of race, whether they're white, black, purple, or green, the fact is they see humanity being destroyed. And as I said earlier, they see that their community is being destroyed economically, socially, the unrest. You get enough people pissed off and angry enough, we lose our homes, I don't have jobs. A lot of the people, we're talking 30-some million people out of work because of COVID-19. That's a lot of people that can protest. They don't have to go to work. I mean, where they going to go to work? And then the economic package that came with it said, I'm going to give you an extra $600 a week so that you can get back on your feet. Okay, well, I'm getting paid while I'm not working. So basically, you're paying me to protest. So all the storm came together at once. So what you tried to do was destroy, and you created the perfect storm for people to be in the streets and still eat, because that's what a protest is all about. I'll tell a quick story. In the early 1950s and 60s, when they first started protesting around civil rights movement, who did you send out to do their civil rights protests? You sent college students. Because back in the 60s and 70s, college students didn't usually have jobs. They interned for free, and their parents were paying for them to go to school, or they might work a little part-time job at their parents' shop or somewhere. So you provided for the boots or the bodies on the ground. The people that could do the sit-ins were college students because, hey, I go to work tomorrow. Nope, I don't go to work, so you can't fire me. So I can protest all day. I get locked up. I go to Morgan State College, Morgan State University now. I'm going to be excused because I was in prison for protesting.
There's no mortgages to pay.
Say again?
And there's no mortgages to pay or car payments.
No mortgages to pay. I mean, you had the Bethlehem Steel, which killed off a lot of people, but people were making so much money. If the mortgage was $100 and I was making $800 a month, now I have an extra $100 to send you to Morgan. I have an extra $100 for my car. I'm paying that off. I'm able to stay in this community. Hey, you work hard. Hey, you want to bring your son over too? You got any cousins that work like you? Now the whole family is dying off from cancer and everything else. They say you park down there, your car is covered in orange because of all the dust coming from the steel, and the blacks had to work at the top of the smokestacks. All of these things would need to be discussed and dealt with at a health level. But to what Mr. Swartz said, as much as we talk about race, it's all a farce. It's just a cover for the fact that we want somebody to be held down so somebody could be lifted up. But we're all holding each other down if you're holding somebody down. And that's where we have to get to a place to recognize. We just need to stop this nonsense and deal with the facts and the truth, because truth is more about how I see it, how Charles sees it, how Andy sees it. Facts can't be erased. So as we begin to deal with these things and deal with human beings have true pain, and that pain leads to true disease, that leads to true economic and social cost. If you all want to pay it, keep the quasi integration. If you don't want to pay it, let's get to a place where we all look out, fight for, and stand together as we heal.
Thank you so much.
And I think here's the thing with race. Obviously, it's a social construct and it's made up and all that, but it has huge impacts that we see it every day, right? I think for too long, this country was trying to get beyond race without dealing with it. And, we went through this process and this idea of diversity training, and we thought this was the magic bullet. If you can just train everybody to just be PC and not say the wrong things and behave well in a work environment, that the world will somehow shift on its own. But that kind of process actually snuffed out the conversations that are important and ought to be part of our collective working through all this. And it made it just more comfortable for white people and left out everybody else to just kind of work around it. And I think we are seeing the fruits of that. The idea that because we try to snuff out that conversation on race, to fast forward it bubbled through. And that's going to keep bubbling through unless we actually deal with it head on. So in order for us to become post-racial, as all of us, I think, would like to see sometime, maybe not our generation, another generation or whatever, we have to become more racial. We have to really focus on race a lot more in order for us to come out on the other side being colorblind, as some people would like to think.
But not the differences as much as the commonalities. They're doing research now in I think it's in like England or Europe, I think in Italy. They're looking to see, is there something about the genetics of blacks that cause COVID-19 to be more impacting without race being, and this is the same eugenics epigenetic conversation that happened before. To try to find a way to say, black people get COVID-19 differently, as if we all don't have some Homo sapien, some African, and some Homo Neanderthal in our blood and our genes. At the end of the day, you're a human being, and as long as you said, we try to find these dividing lines. And I'm not saying race shouldn't be discussed. What I'm saying, to Will's point, is whites standing on the front lines need to be respected too, because they're human. And as long as we have people standing up, we should be happy to have people, because 13% cannot fix the problems of 100%. We need everybody to come to the table and say enough. We need everybody to come to the table and say that there's no way in hell we're going to keep allowing for people to be hurt, harmed, and killed by those who overseer officer, those who are really acting in the guise of an overseer, but having the badge of an officer. And we need to be in a position to face that. You don't have a job to be judge, jury, and executioner. You have a job to find the person, hold them, and let justice find itself through the proper system.
If I could just add, I think in a larger sense, Dr. Henderson, I think what we're asking people to do is, I think we're trying to, move the ship of state, steer the ship of state towards empathy. And I don't think that's asking too much. I got to tell you, I know I'm naive, but I think that's kind of the idea. And I think it can be taught.
Yeah.
All
right. Are we almost done, Dr. Chavis?
I think we are almost approaching that time. I did want to briefly follow up. I think my question is slipping. Audrey, do we have one more question?
Yeah.
I'll remember mine in a second. Go ahead.
Yeah. And so we have we slated to end at 7:30, and we'll want to break just a little bit early to kind of loop people in on the next events. So I'm just gonna kind of clump a few of the last questions from the audience, and we've been having, you might have been able to notice it, and I know some of you have been trying to respond here and there, but we've had a really just fascinating discussion happening in the chat. And I want to just, first of all, thank all of our attendees for once again just being so engaged with each other. So I'm going to try to touch upon a few of the questions that we have left, so that maybe Will and Dr. Henderson, these questions can inform your maybe closing statement for this evening. So we've had a question about I think truth and reconciliation has come up here, and obviously we talk a lot about the South Africa case, but actually we've had a question about the case in Canada, if anyone has any insights on that in terms of actually the truth and reconciliation process for Indigenous children in the Indian residential school system. I know obviously there are a lot of, unique aspects of these two cases, but I think that offers, maybe some interesting discussion about truth and reconciliation generally. There's also a question, I think, Dr. Henderson, you were already talking a little bit about this, but it's a question from one of our doctoral, from one of our research fellows actually at the John Mitchell program, Vanga da Silva, regarding just kind of the symbolism of having, of carrying out these brutal lynchings, specifically at the courthouse lawn. And, Will, I'm sure you can talk about this a little bit as well, but, what was the symbolism of that? And, I don't know if this was really in the original question, but Benga, it got me thinking too, do we see parallels of that? Actually, it wasn't the original question, parallels of that in this era of police brutality. I mean, are there similar power plays going on with that kind of symbolism? And there's actually a fairly interesting question here, and I think it might have come after Dr. Henderson. You mentioned that lynching, was also, white communities against white communities. And there's been a question here about, should we be concerned when the current protests and riots that we have seen recently are reminiscent of the mobs that took justice into their own hands? It's a very interesting question, and I think it might offer some, maybe a different type of discussion than we've been having right now. And I just want to apologize to anyone whose question I couldn't get to, but I'll leave it to Dr. Chavis for his question and then final remarks.
Yeah, so I think, for me, in terms of the systemic piece, right? Because we see these things happening over and over again. As much as we've talked about race, as much as we've shouted out Black Lives Matter, these things are continuing to happen, even in the midst of all of these protests. And we're all encouraged by what we're seeing, specifically as it relates to members of the white community and those across the globe speaking out against what's going on in America. However, what I think is important for us to understand in this moment, if we don't have systemic change, then these things will continue. And this is evidenced in the recent case over the weekend. We had brother, I believe, Robert Brooks, who was gunned down. And I watched, in tears, the press conference from with his family there. And, after one of his cousins spoke about how they lost, their loved one, the attorney told the press, I'll probably be here in another month or so, right? And in spite of everything that we're seeing, the uproar and disgust towards, the systemic racism and these, what we're witnessing, if there's not systemic change, this will continue and the trauma will continue. And I really wanted to just close out on that as a point for us to think about and consider. And we can continue and we'll answer some of those questions in the Facebook page. But I did want to thank Dr. Henderson, as well as Will Schwarz, as well as Andy Shallal, as well as everyone at the Carter School and the Mitchell program for helping us put this event together. And Audrey, I believe she has a few more things as it relates to next week's event. I don't know if I've told you, Audrey, but we will have the daughter of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Reverend Nantumbi Tutu, who will be joining us to discuss the legacy of her father's work, as well as the work that she's doing specifically in the U.S. and globally. So, go ahead, Audrey.
Yeah, I think you got it, Dr. Chavis. But yeah, just to remind everyone, this is part of a series. We will put the link to our Facebook group in the chat so that people can also join the conversation there. I want to, turn it over to Andy, to Dr. Henderson, and to Will for any final remarks they want to make regarding just kind of the fantastic discussion we've had tonight.
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Audrey, and thank you, Charles. Let's go to Corey for maybe any closing comments, and then to Will, and then I will say goodbye to everyone.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank you for allowing me to be a part of this conversation. The work that I do, I just want to really stop for a moment and take a pause, because I don't think we do that enough. And I think that what Dr. Charles Chavis said, it hurts. I'm not even where he's at. We're not in the same house. We're not in the same building, but I feel his pain when he said he watched the conference, the news conference, in tears. I think it's okay, as Mr. Swartz said, as Will said, that we need to be in a position where we're empathetic and it's okay to cry. It's okay to be human. That's how healing happens, is that we tap into our humanity and the realness of, I'm not a machine in a physical sense. I'm a human being. And to see someone get shot in the back, to see someone get murdered because they stole a candy bar or they're selling a CD or something that would never find them in prison to be killed, it's heartbreaking. And that part of this makes me want to face the reality that there are systems that we need to tear down. And those systems, to the point of systemic racism, systemic segregation, systemic discrimination, systemic sexism, systemic miscegenation, all of the things that people don't want and don't like, we need to face them. And I want to close on what James Baldwin said. He said that not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced.
Thank you. Will.
That's tough to follow right there. So thank you as well for allowing me to be part of this. It was a great experience. I just think I have no terribly wise thoughts to end with. I would just say that all of this work, you know, the work that we do, the work that Dr. Henderson is doing, the work that all the people who are watching this are doing, it's all important. You know, there's not going to be one switch that flips. One thing that I've kind of grown to appreciate over the last couple of years that I've been doing this is that, you know, this is a machine. The white supremacy is a machine, and it needs to be dismantled piece by piece. And so everyone has to do their part and take care of the piece that's right in front of them.
What a great film. Really was, it was a fantastically made film, made the point beautifully. Thank you so much, Will Schwarz. Thank you, Dr. Henderson, for your insight. Really, I learned so much today, I have to tell you. Thank you so much for your wisdom. It was really, really special. And of course, thank you so much, Charles, for allowing me to be a collaborator in this great conversation, which is so, so timely. Of course, I've been doing this for 15 years, and every year I say so timely. So maybe this is really the timely moment for it. I want to remind people that we do this every week on Mondays. We'll continue to do it until we change, maybe till monthly, whatever. But for now, it's weekly. We appreciate everybody that logs in and is part of it. This coming Friday, we have a very special guest. I do these things called Zoom dinners with Dr. Ibrahim Kindi. He's at American University, but he's moving to Boston University. But he writes a lot about anti-racism, and he has a new book called Anti-Racist Baby. It's a children's book, really, really well done, well illustrated. And that's at 6 p.m. We'll send out a link, and you can watch it on our social media. So, and I thank Audrey and our team from Busboys and Poets for making this series possible. Any last words, Dr. Chavis?
No, that's it. Dr. Henderson, if you can tell everyone where you can be reached, I think that would be great to learn more about the resources that you offer as well, Will, and just give your handles for the Maryland Lynching Memorial Project. I think we can close with that.
Yeah, so my name is Corey Jermaine Henderson. So my website is cjhdrph.com.
Great. Thank you so much. Will?
Thanks. And I see that Audrey just put our website in the chat window, so that'll get you to us.
Great. Well, thank you again.
Thank you.